In the winter of 1881, when the temperatures on the vast, unforgiving prairies of Nebraska plummeted to 40 degrees below zero, the world did not just freeze. It turned brittle and lethal. That year, the wind was not a guest, but an executioner. It swept across the flatlands with a razor's edge, carrying no moisture, only the promise of a crystalline death. In the fledgling settlement of Broken Creek, the proudest structures, the two-story houses of milled lumber with their steep gables and glass windows brought by rail from the refined cities of the East, became nothing more than wooden tombs. The wealthiest men in the county, men who measured their worth in the height of their barns and the polish of their floorboards, watched in helpless terror as their families shivered under every scrap of wool and hide they possessed. Inside those houses, the atmosphere was a paradox. The air near the grand stone fireplaces was scorched and dry, while only 5 feet away the water in the wash basins turned to solid blocks of ice. The cattle, those great beasts that represented years of investment and sweat, died standing up in the fields, frozen mid-breath into statues of stiffened flesh, their eyes glazed over with a frost that no sun could melt. In the dead of night, the silence of the prairie was shattered by sounds like rifle shots, not from hunters, but from the trees themselves, as the sap deep within their trunks expanded under the grip of the cold until the bark and wood literally exploded. But on a specific hill to the north of the settlement, a place where the soil was considered so poor and stony that even the most desperate homesteaders had turned their backs on it, there was a sign of life. Half buried in the snowy slope, almost invisible against the white-on-white horizon, stood a modest door of reclaimed wood. And behind that door, a 16-year-old girl lay sleeping. She was wrapped in a single worn quilt, her breath coming in slow, steady rhythms. Her cheeks were not pale with the touch of death, but flushed a healthy rose, and her fingers, tucked beneath her chin, remained warm to the touch. Her name was Kathleen O'Brien. For months, the people of Broken Creek had spoken of her in the past tense, treating her existence as a tragic, if inevitable, footnote to the harsh reality of the frontier. They had prophesied her death with a mix of pity and self-righteous certainty. They were wrong. The exile's arrival, 6 months prior, in the sweltering heat of July, Kathleen had arrived in Broken Creek not by wagon or stagecoach, but on foot. She had walked from Omaha, a journey of grueling miles that had worn the soles of her boots to paper-thin leather. She carried only a canvas rucksack, $15 sewn with trembling fingers into the heavy wool lining of her skirt, and a letter from her stepmother, a cold, final dismissal that Kathleen had burned in a campfire weeks ago to save herself from the poison of its words. She had just turned 16. Her hair was a wild, defiant red, the color of forge fire in a dark smithy, and she possessed eyes that seemed to have seen too much for a child of her years. But it was her silhouette that drew the sharpest glares from the townspeople. Her belly was beginning to swell, a soft curve that spoke of a secret she couldn't hide and a sin the world wouldn't forget. There was no husband to claim her, no ring to shield her, and in the year 1880, there was no mercy for a girl in her condition. Broken Creek was a town built on hard work and even harder judgments. It was a place where civilization was a fragile, thin veneer applied over the raw survival of the plains. When Kathleen first walked into the settlement's only general store, the air inside was thick with the scent of brine, unwashed wool, and cheap tobacco. As she approached the counter and asked about the process for claiming land under the Homestead Act, a heavy, suffocating silence fell over the room. The men sitting on crates near the potbelly stove suddenly found their boots fascinating. The women, who had been gossiping over bolts of calico, adjusted their shawls with sharp, rhythmic movements and turned their heads away, as if looking at Kathleen might stain their own reputations. It was Mr. Cornelius Vanderberg who finally broke the silence. Cornelius was the undisputed king of Broken Creek. He was 42, prosperous, and looked every bit the part. His mustache was waxed into perfect, lethal points, and he stood with his thumbs hooked into his floral-patterned suspenders, a man who occupied space with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. He owned thousands of cattle and a house that was the envy of the territory, a white-painted manor with a wraparound porch that stood as a monument to his dominance over the land. "Now look here, girl," Cornelius said. He pitched his voice to sound paternal, but beneath the surface, it carried the weight of a judge passing sentence. "This isn't a playground. This territory is no place for a woman on her own, and certainly not for one in your particular state. The Christian thing, the only sensible thing, would be for you to turn right back around and find your people. There must be a family somewhere that will take you in out of charity." Kathleen didn't flinch. She felt the straps of her rucksack digging into her tired shoulders, but she stood her ground. "My family is the one that showed me the door, sir, and they made sure it was locked behind me. I'm a citizen of this country, same as you, and the law says that any citizen can claim 160 acres if they have the will to work them. I have the will." A short, dry laugh erupted from the corner. It came from Mr. Tobias Henriksen, a Norwegian immigrant in his 50s. Tobias was a man of wood and nails, the finest carpenter in the region. His hands were a map of scars and sawdust, and he believed that if a problem couldn't be solved with a hammer, it wasn't worth solving. "Work them?" Tobias asked, shaking his head. "Nina, you don't understand. This isn't the gentle soil of the East. Here the wind is a thief. It rips the nails right out of the siding. It shrieks through the gaps until you go mad. The first winter will take you before the first real snow even touches the ground. You'll be a frozen crow in a field by December." Then came Mrs. Prudence Carlyle. As the wife of the local preacher, Prudence considered herself the moral compass of the settlement. She was a woman of sharp angles and stiffened lace, dressed in a black gown that seemed to drain the color from the air around her. Her gray eyes were not unkind, but they were devoid of warmth. They were eyes that evaluated a person's soul based on their proximity to the church pews. "There is an orphanage in Lincoln, Kathleen," Prudence said, her voice like alnico. "A place where the child can be given to decent, God-fearing people who can provide a proper home. You could start over. You could scrub your name clean and find work as a domestic. That is the path of repentance." Kathleen felt a familiar heat rising in her chest. It wasn't just anger. It was an ancient, stubborn strength she had inherited from her maternal grandmother. Her grandmother had been a woman of New Mexico, a mestiza who had lived her life in the shadow of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. She had taught Kathleen that the earth was the only mother who didn't care about your past, your sins, or your lack of a husband. The earth only cared about how you treated it. "I appreciate your concern, all of you," Kathleen said, her voice gaining a resonance that surprised even herself. "But I didn't walk all this way to give up my child or my future to someone else's idea of decent. I'm staying. I'll take the northern parcel." The three leaders of the town exchanged a look that was more eloquent than any sermon. It was a look of profound dismissal. In their minds, they were already deciding where they would have to bury her come spring. To them, she was already a ghost, the hill of stone. The parcel Kathleen claimed was a joke among the men of Broken Creek. It was a rugged, wind-swept incline where the soil was packed so tight it felt like digging into concrete. No trees grew there. The wind wouldn't allow it. The grass was a sickly, pale yellow, and there was no creek or spring in sight. It was land that even the most desperate sodbusters had rejected as a lost cause. The first night Kathleen slept under the stars. The vastness of the Nebraska sky was terrifying, a deep, indigo bowl filled with more stars than she had ever imagined. The wind moaned across the grass, a lonely, predatory sound that made her huddle closer to her rucksack. The second night was the same, the cold of the prairie night beginning to seep into her bones. On the third day, as the sun began to bake the earth, Kathleen didn't look for wood. She didn't look for a carpenter. She picked up a shovel she had purchased secondhand for $2.50, a heavy, rusted tool with a hickory handle smoothed by years of use, and she began to dig. She wasn't digging a hole. She was remembering. She remembered her grandmother's voice, thick with the accent of the high desert, as they sat on an adobe porch in Santa Fe peeling beans. Her grandmother had told her stories of the old days, of the gente pobre, who had survived the wars between the Spanish and the Comanches. "The earth itself embraces you, mija," her grandmother would say, her hands like weathered bark tracing patterns in the dust. "When the sky is angry and the wind wants to eat your spirit, you go into the earth. She protects you from the gale. She hides you from the sun. She keeps the warmth of the summer deep in her belly to give back to you when the frost comes." Do not fight the land, Kathleen. Do not try to stand above it, like those men who build towers of sticks. Accept the land, and she will accept you. Kathleen chose a slope that faced due south. It was a strategic choice. In the winter, the low arc of the sun would shine directly into her doorway, providing natural light and warmth. She began to excavate horizontally into the hillside. It was grueling, soul-crushing work. Because she was digging into a slope, she didn't have to worry about the dugout filling with water like a pit. The natural gravity would pull any moisture away. But the earth was stubborn. It was a compact mass of clay, roots, and ancient stones. By the third day of digging, Mr. Vanderburg rode by on his thoroughbred. He pulled up his horse and sat in his ornate leather saddle, looking down at Kathleen with a mixture of confusion and disgust. Kathleen was a sight. Her face was smeared with dark clay, her hair was matted with sweat and dirt, and her hands were already beginning to weep from the first layer of blisters. "What in the name of all that is holy are you doing, girl?" Cornelius asked, his horse shifting restlessly. Kathleen didn't stop. She drove the spade into the clay with the weight of her entire body. "I'm building my home, sir." Cornelius took off his hat and wiped his brow, laughing derisively. "That's a cave. That's a hole for a badger or a coyote. Civilized people build with lumber. They build with walls that stand straight and true. You're digging a grave for yourself. Milled lumber costs $80 for a shack that the wind will whistle through, Mr. Vanderburg," Kathleen replied, wiping the sweat from her eyes with a dirty forearm. "I have $15 total, and $80 houses didn't stop 3 families from losing their toes to frostbite last year, did they?" Cornelius's expression soured. He didn't like the reminder that his civilization was often an illusion. He spurred his horse and galloped away, the hooves kicking up clods of earth that hit Kathleen's unfinished wall. The architect of necessity, over the next 3 weeks, Kathleen became a creature of the earth. She woke with the first light, when the prairie was still painted in shades of gray and lavender, and she worked until her vision blurred and the stars took their places. Her hands, which had once been soft and delicate, transformed. The blisters broke, bled, and then healed into thick, yellowish calluses. Her fingernails were worn down to the quick. The muscles in her back and shoulders burned with a constant throbbing heat that made sleep a restless necessity rather than a comfort. But the dugout grew. She excavated a rectangular space approximately 4 meters wide and 6 meters deep. She made sure the ceiling was high enough, 2.5 meters, so she wouldn't feel the weight of the hill pressing down on her spirit. Then came the secret her grandmother had whispered. The secret the educated men of Broken Creek could never grasp, thermal mass. Kathleen knew that if she left the walls as raw dirt, they would eventually crumble or turn to mud in a heavy rain. She went down to the dry creek bed and gathered buckets of fine silt. She mixed it with water and handfuls of dried prairie grass that she had chopped into small fibers. She created a primitive yet effective plaster, a version of adobe. With her bare hands, she smeared this mixture over the walls in thin, even layers. As the sun baked the plaster, it turned into a hard, leather-like surface that was surprisingly smooth to the touch. It sealed the earth, preventing dust from falling and providing a barrier against insects. For the roof, she needed structure. She spent 4 days walking to a distant grove of cottonwoods along the main river. These weren't the straight, majestic pines of the east. They were gnarled, twisted trees. But they were free. She used a small hand axe to fell the sturdiest branches she could find. The task of moving them was Herculean. She didn't have a horse or a mule. She tied a hemp rope around her waist and harnessed herself to the logs, dragging them one by one across the 3 miles of open prairie. Each trip took half a day. She would collapse in the grass, her lungs screaming for air, her belly tight with the weight of the child, only to get up and do it again. She laid the logs across the top of her excavation, spacing them carefully. Over the logs, she wove a dense mat of willow branches and tall grass. Then came her biggest investment, a $3 waterproof canvas tarp she had bought from the store. She spread the tarp over the branches to ensure no leak would ever reach her bed. Finally, she piled 60 centimeters of the very sod she had excavated back on top. To the outside world, she hadn't built a house. She had simply created a slightly larger mound on the hill. But to Kathleen, it was a fortress. By the final week of August, the dugout was a functional shell, but it was far from a home. While the men of Broken Creek were busy raising barns with communal help and rhythmic hammering, Kathleen worked in a silence broken only by the whistling wind and the rhythmic thud of her own tools. She was now visibly pregnant, her movements slower but infused with a deliberate, desperate precision. Every ounce of energy had to count: the thermal battery, fire and stone. Kathleen knew that surviving a Nebraska winter wasn't just about blocking the wind. It was about capturing and holding heat. A wooden house, she knew, acted like a sieve. You could burn a cord of wood in a fireplace, and most of that energy would simply flee up the chimney, leaving the corners of the room as cold as a tomb. She returned to the general store with her remaining coins. The owner, a man named Miller who was slightly less judgmental than Vanderberg, watched her curiously as she ignored the shiny, expensive stoves from St. Louis. Instead, she pointed to a battered, rusted iron barrel sitting in the yard. It had been used to store lard and was dented so badly it leaned to one side. "You want that piece of junk?" Miller asked, leaning on the counter. "I was going to sell it to the smithy for scrap." $2, Kathleen said firmly, "and 30 cents if you have the smithy weld those 2 holes in the bottom." Miller shrugged. "It's your funeral, O'Brien, but that won't hold a fire like a proper cast iron range." "It doesn't need to," she replied. What Kathleen built next was a masterpiece of ancestral engineering that the modern men of the town would have found laughable until it saved their lives. Before installing the barrel, she excavated a deep pit in the center of her dirt floor, 1 meter deep and nearly 2 meters wide. She then spent 3 days hauling large, smooth river stones from the creek. These weren't just rocks. They were her life insurance. She filled the pit with the stones and then set the iron barrel directly on top of them. She fashioned a chimney pipe from scraps of tin, venting it through a meticulously sealed hole in her sod roof. The principle was simple. When she lit a fire in the barrel, the metal would heat up quickly to warm the air. But more importantly, the heat would conduct downward, soaking into the massive pit of stones. The earth and the rocks would act as a thermal battery. Long after the last ember in the barrel had died out, those stones would continue to radiate a steady, gentle warmth upward through the floor for 12 to 14 hours. It was the same wisdom her grandmother's people had used in the high deserts for 1,000 years. The inspection of the righteous. In mid-September, just as the goldenrod began to fade and the first hint of autumn's chill touched the night air, the town's moral committee arrived. Mrs. Prudence Carlyle led the way, followed by the Reverend Carlyle and 2 other women from the church circle. They arrived in a polished buggy, their faces set in expressions of grim duty. They didn't even wait for Kathleen to invite them. They stood at the top of her hill, looking down at the mound of dirt that was her roof with undisguised horror. "Kathleen O'Brien?" Prudence called out, her voice sharp enough to cut the prairie grass. Kathleen emerged from her doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked tired, but there was a new iron in her gaze. "Good morning, Mrs. Carlyle." "Reverend?" The Reverend, a man as thin and brittle as a dried cornstalk, peered into the dark opening of the dugout. He pulled back as if he smelled sulfur. "Child, we have come on a mission of mercy. Rumors have reached us that you intend to bring a new soul, a Christian child, into this burrow." "It is my home, Reverend," Kathleen said softly. "It is a pit," Prudence snapped, stepping forward. "It is undignified. It is the way an animal lives, not a human being. There are standards of decency, Kathleen. A child needs light. A child needs 4 walls of wood and a floor that isn't made of the very dust we are cursed to return to." "My floor is stone, ma'am, and my walls don't shake when the wind blows," Kathleen replied. "My son will be warm, while your parishioners are burning their furniture to stay alive." The Reverend's face turned a dusty shade of red. Pride is a deadly sin, especially in one who has already strayed so far from the path of virtue. We have the authority to report this to the territorial officials. If a dwelling is deemed unfit, the child can be removed for its own safety. Kathleen felt a coldness in her veins that had nothing to do with the weather. She stepped closer to the Reverend, her height nearly matching his. "I am working this land as the law requires. I have built a structure that is dry, stable, and warm. If you try to take my child, because my house is made of the earth God created, instead of the wood you sell at a profit, you will find that I can be as stubborn as this hill. I suggest you spend more time worrying about the cracks in your own church's foundation and less about the depth of my floor." They left in a flurry of indignant whispers and clicking tongues, leaving behind a trail of disapproval that felt as tangible as the dust kicked up by their buggy. But Kathleen didn't have time for their malice. The birds were moving south in massive, silent ribbons across the sky. The signal was clear: the invisible fortress. As October arrived, the transformation of Broken Creek began in earnest. The wealthy families were busy. Mr. Vanderberg brought in 2 more carloads of coal and wood, stacking them in mountains behind his grand white house. Mr. Henriksen was hired to add a winter parlor to the Carlyle home, a room with thick walls of oak intended to be the family's last stand against the frost. Kathleen, meanwhile, was focused on the small things. She spent her days gathering buffalo chips, dried bison manure, and stacking it in neat ricks against the north side of her hill. To the townspeople, this was the ultimate sign of her savagery. "She's burning dung," they whispered in the store, "like an Indian or a beast." But Kathleen knew better. Buffalo chips burned slow, steady, and produced a sweet, musky heat without the dangerous sparks or rapid consumption of pine. She also focused on the airtight seal. While the wooden houses were expanding and contracting with the temperature changes, opening tiny gaps for the wind to whistle through, Kathleen was sealing her world. She crafted a heavy curtain made from 3 layers of grain sacks, dyed with tea and stuffed with dried wool. She hung this just inside her wooden door. It created a mudroom effect, an airlock that prevented the precious warm air from escaping when she entered or exited. She dug a small drainage trench around her doorway, lining it with pebbles to ensure that when the snow eventually melted, it would flow away from her sanctuary. Inside, she carved out niches in the earthen walls, shelves for her few possessions. A pewter plate, a single book of poetry, her Bible, and the small tin of lard she used for her lamp. The first warning on the night of October 20th, the prairie showed its teeth for the first time. A clipper blew in from the north. In the settlement, the temperature dropped to 5 degrees above zero in an hour. In the Vanderburg mansion, Cornelius woke to the sound of his house groaning. The milled lumber, still slightly green, was shrinking in the cold. Crack. Pop. The sounds echoed like ghostly footsteps through the halls. Despite the fire roaring in the main hearth, a glass of water on his nightstand developed a thin skin of ice. But on the northern hill, Kathleen O'Brien slept in a silence so deep it felt holy. When she woke, she didn't shiver. She stepped out of bed and felt the floor. It was slightly warm to the touch. The stones were doing their work. She lit a small candle. The flame was perfectly still. There were no drafts to make it flicker. The temperature inside was a steady 65 degrees. She walked to her south-facing window, the one she had covered with oiled paper since she couldn't afford glass. The paper glowed with a soft, amber light as the sun rose. She peeked outside. The world was covered in a heavy hoarfrost, every blade of grass encased in a diamond sheath. She saw Mr. Henriksen riding past, his coat collar turned up, his face red. He stopped his horse and looked at the smoke curling lazily from the pipe in Kathleen's hill. He didn't wave, he didn't shout. He simply stared for a long minute at the girl who was supposed to be freezing, yet stood in her doorway without a shawl, her skin glowing with warmth. He rode on, but the seed of doubt had been planted. The mad Irish girl wasn't just surviving. She was thriving in a way his carpentry couldn't explain. As November descended upon Nebraska, the golden light of autumn was replaced by a sky the color of a bruised plum. The wind no longer just moaned. It shrieked across the open plains, carrying a bite that could numb a man's ears in minutes. In the settlement of Broken Creek, the confidence of summer was rapidly eroding. The physics of the hearth. The wooden houses in the valley were failing. Mr. Henriksen, despite his mastery of the hammer, was finding that wood is a restless material. It breathes. It moves. In the intense dryness of the prairie winter, the boards shrunk, pulling away from the window frames and door sills. Tiny, invisible gaps appeared everywhere. The wind, pressurized by the vastness of the plains, forced its way through these cracks in thin, needle-like streams of ice-cold air. In the Carlisle home, the preacher was discovering the treachery of the modern chimney. When the wind blew from the north at 40 miles per hour, it created a pocket of high pressure over his roof, forcing the smoke back down the flue. His winter parlor was often filled with a thick, acrid haze that stung the eyes and blackened the lungs. They had to choose between breathing and freezing. Kathleen, however, was living in a realm of absolute thermal stability. Her thermal battery, the pit of river stones, was now fully charged. By burning just 4 or 5 buffalo chips in the morning and the same in the evening, she kept the iron barrel at a low, consistent glow. The stones beneath acted like a giant, slow-beating heart, radiating infrared heat that warmed the objects in the room rather than just the air. Because her walls were 2 meters of solid earth, she had zero infiltration. The wind could shriek at 80 miles per hour outside, but inside her dugout, a candle flame wouldn't even tilt. The earth acted as a perfect muffler. The terrifying roar of the prairie storm was reduced to a soft, rhythmic thrumming, like the sound of distant surf. The visitation of the skeptic one afternoon in late November. A lone rider approached the hill. It was Thomas Henriksen, the carpenter's 14-year-old son. He was a boy built like his father, square-shouldered and taciturn, but his eyes held a spark of curiosity that the older man had long since buried under tradition. He tied his horse to a rock and stood before Kathleen's door, hesitating. Kathleen opened the door before he could knock, the heavy grain sack curtain billowing slightly as the air pressures equalized. "My pa sent me to see if you were still alive," Thomas said, his voice cracking. He was bundled in a heavy bearskin coat, his nose a vivid purple. "Tell your father I'm quite well, Thomas. Would you like to come in? Your horse looks like he could use a rest from the wind." Thomas stepped down the 15-centimeter drop into the dugout. As he cleared the inner curtain, he stopped dead. He began to unbutton his heavy coat almost immediately. It's like May in here," he whispered, looking around at the smooth, mud-plastered walls. "How? I don't see a giant fire. My pa is burning 3 cords of oak a week, and we still have to wear our hats at the dinner table." "It's the earth, Thomas," Kathleen said, offering him a tin cup of warm mint tea. "Your father builds houses that stand on the land, fighting it. I built a house that is part of the land. The earth holds onto the sun's memory long after the sun has gone." Thomas stayed for nearly an hour, touching the walls, feeling the warmth of the stone floor through his boots, and examining the barrel stove. When he left, he looked at the hole in the ground with a sense of awe. He realized then that the disgraced girl was the only true architect in Broken Creek. The sky turns yellow. On the morning of December 23rd, the world changed. The old-timers, like Jedediah the trapper, stood on their porches and sniffed the air. The sky wasn't blue, and it wasn't gray. It was a sickly, bruised sulfur yellow. The birds had vanished completely. Even the field mice, usually busy in the straw, had gone deep and silent. "The big one," Jedediah whispered to anyone who would listen. "Get your stock in. Tie a rope from the house to the well. If you get lost in the white, you're a dead man." By noon, the temperature began to plummet. It didn't drop degree by degree. It fell like a stone in a well. 40 degrees, 20 degrees, 0. By 3 o'clock, the wind arrived. It came with a sound that Kathleen would later describe as 1,000 freight trains screaming at once. It carried the fine-grained snow of the high plains, not flakes, but tiny crystalline needles of ice that could penetrate any fabric and scour the skin raw. The great blizzard of 1880 had begun. The siege of the wooden tombs. In the valley, the horror was immediate. At the Vanderburg Ranch, the pride of the county, the great white house, became a sieve. The wind slammed into the northern wall with such force that the glass windows bowed inward. Cornelius and his sons spent the first 6 hours of the storm frantically nailing boards over the glass, their hands freezing to the hammers. By midnight, the wind had found the gaps in the floorboards. The expensive carpets began to ripple like the surface of a pond. The heat from the grand fireplaces was being sucked out of the chimneys by the sheer vacuum of the gale. Cornelius realized with a jolt of terror that his massive stockpile of wood was disappearing at 3 times the normal rate. At the Henriksen house, Tobias watched in despair as his winter parlor failed. The wind was so strong it actually forced the cold air through the wood grain. His wife, her cough now a wet, rattling sound, lay in bed shivering under 6 layers of quilts. Tobias stood by the hearth, feeding it until the iron glowed red, but the air 6 feet away remained at the freezing point. At the Carlisle home, the chimney problem became a catastrophe. The northerly gale created such a backdraft that the house filled with suffocating wood smoke. They had to douse the fire to keep from choking, and within 30 minutes, the temperature inside the modern home matched the temperature outside, 30 degrees below zero. The sanctuary in the hill. On the northern hill, Kathleen O'Brien sat in her rocking chair, a simple gift from Miller at the store. She was sewing by the light of a single tallow candle. Outside, the world was being erased. The snow was drifting in mountainous waves, burying the fences and the outbuildings. The wind was so loud it sounded like the hill itself was screaming. But inside, the candle flame didn't even shiver. Kathleen reached out and touched the wall. It was cool, but not cold. She looked at her thermal battery. The barrel stove was barely warm to the touch, but the stones beneath were radiating a steady, life-giving heat. The temperature was a perfect, unwavering 62 degrees. She felt the baby move in her womb. A strong, rhythmic kick. "We're safe, little one," she whispered. "The earth has us in her arms." She ate a bowl of hot cornmeal mush, the steam rising in the quiet air. She was the only person in Broken Creek who wasn't fighting for their life that night. She was the only one who wasn't afraid. The breaking point. By the second night of the storm, the temperature outside hit 42 degrees below zero. In the Vanderberg house, the water in the tea kettle, sitting on the edge of the hearth, froze solid. The family was huddled in a single room, their breath forming a thick fog that turned to frost on the walls. Cornelius looked at his remaining wood and knew they wouldn't last another 24 hours. In the Henriksen house, Tobias's wife was fading. Her lips were blue, her breathing shallow. Tobias, the master builder, looked at his 4 walls of oak and saw them for what they were, a cage of ice. In the Carlisle home, the preacher was on his knees, not praying for a sermon, but begging for a miracle. His daughter's feet were white and hard as marble. Frostbite had taken hold. And then, as if by some communal instinct of survival, they all remembered the same thing. They remembered the girl they had called a beast and a sinner. They remembered the smokestack poking out of the hill. They knew that if they stayed in their wooden tombs, they would be found as statues in the spring. The dawn of the third day did not bring light, only a shift from the obsidian black of the night to a disorienting, ghostly violet. The blizzard had reached its zenith. The wind was no longer a sound. It was a physical weight that pressed against the chest, making every breath a battle. In the valley, the breaking point had been reached. Cornelius Vanderberg, a man who had built his life on the solid foundations of property and prestige, stood in the center of his frozen parlor. His fine East Coast furniture, mahogany chairs and oak tables, had been broken into splinters to feed the dying fire. His wife's piano had been sacrificed hours ago. Yet, the cold was winning. It seeped through the floorboards like a rising tide. "We have to go," Cornelius croaked, his voice raw from the dry air. "Go where?" his son asked, huddling under a mountain of frozen furs. "We'll die in 10 minutes out there." "To the girl?" Cornelius said, his eyes hollow. "To the hill? It's the only chimney still smoking. The exodus of the damned. It was a journey of less than a mile, but it was a trek through the heart of a white hell. The families of Broken Creek, the Vanderbergs, the Henriksens, and the Carlyles, found each other in the swirling chaos. They moved like a slow, ragged chain of ghosts, tied together by ropes, blinded by the needles of ice that sought to freeze their eyelids shut. Tobias Henriksen carried his wife, her body a terrifyingly light weight in his arms. The preacher Carlyle clutched his daughter, whose feet were now senseless blocks of ice. They were no longer the decent people of the town. They were shivering animals, stripped of their lace and their labels, seeking the only warmth left in the world. When they reached the northern hill, they couldn't even see the dugout. It was completely buried under a massive drift of snow. Only the very tip of the iron flue pipe remained visible, gasping a thin, defiant ribbon of blue smoke into the gale. They fell upon the drift, digging with their bare, frozen hands. Finally, their fingers struck wood, the reclaimed boards of Kathleen's door. The sanctuary of the outcast. Inside the dugout, Kathleen was startled by the sudden, frantic pounding. It was a hollow sound, muffled by the weight of the snow above. She stood, her hand instinctively shielding her belly, and moved toward the entrance. She pulled back the heavy grain sack curtain. As she unlatched the wooden door, the pressure of the wind nearly ripped it from its hinges. A wall of snow and a blast of sub-zero air erupted into the warm sanctuary. And with the snow came the people. They collapsed into the mudroom space in a heap of frozen wool and frost-covered faces. Kathleen acted without a moment's hesitation. She threw her weight against the door, shoving the snow back and slamming the bolt home. The silence that followed was deafening. The shriek of the storm was instantly reduced to that low, rhythmic thrumming of the earth. She pulled the inner curtain closed, sealing the heat back in. "Entrance is 15 centimeters down," Kathleen commanded, her voice calm and authoritative. "Get them to the floor. The stones are warm." The scene was surreal. Cornelius Vanderberg, the man who had called her an animal, lay on her dirt floor, weeping as the feeling returned to his fingers. Tobias Henriksen laid his wife near the barrel stove, watching in disbelief as the steady, radiant heat began to pull the blue from her lips. 14 people now occupied the small space. It should have been suffocating, but the dugout's design saved them. The air was fresh, filtered through the earth and the small vents she had crafted. The temperature, despite the sudden influx of freezing bodies, only dipped slightly before the thermal mass of the stone floor began to pull it back up. The meal of grace Kathleen didn't ask for apologies. She didn't demand an explanation. She moved among them with a quiet maternal grace that defied her 16 years. She melted snow on the barrel stove and brewed a massive pot of tea from dried rose hips and mint. She brought out her small store of hardtack and a jar of salted lard. To the wealthy Vanderbergs, it was more delicious than any feast ever served on their mahogany table. "We said you wouldn't survive," Mrs. Prudence Carlyle whispered, her starched black dress now limp and ruined. She was holding a warm stone Kathleen had wrapped in a rag, pressing it to her daughter's frost-bitten feet. "We prayed for your soul, Kathleen, because we thought you were lost." "You were looking at the hill, Mrs. Carlyle," Kathleen said, sitting on her small stool. "But you weren't looking at the earth. My grandmother taught me that the earth doesn't care if you are a saint or a sinner. She only cares if you are humble enough to ask for her protection." For 3 days, the blizzard raged. Inside the hill, the social hierarchy of Broken Creek dissolved. The wealthy rancher shared a blanket with the disgraced girl. The preacher sat in silence, watching the sinful girl use the wisdom of her pagan ancestors to keep his daughter's toes from turning black with gangrene. They slept on the warm stones. They shared stories. They listened to the heartbeat of the earth. And for the first time in the history of Broken Creek, there was no judgment, only the shared, miraculous heat of survival. The dawn of a new world. On the morning of the 4th day, the wind died. The silence was so sudden it woke them all. They dug their way out through the drift. When they emerged, the world was a blinding, crystalline desert. The settlement of Broken Creek was a graveyard of wooden ruins. The Vanderberg mansion stood, but its interior was shattered. The pipes had burst, the plaster had cracked, and the furniture was ashes. The Henriksen house had lost half its roof. The barns were flattened, and the frozen carcasses of cattle dotted the white landscape like dark, tragic stones. But the hill remained. The dugout was untouched. As the families prepared to return to the valley to rebuild, Cornelius Vanderberg turned to Kathleen. He took off his hat, not with the polite gesture of a gentleman, but with the genuine reverence of a man who had seen the face of a miracle. "I have much to rebuild," Cornelius said, his voice cracking, "but I won't be building the same way. I think I've been living on top of the world. when I should have been living with it. Tobias Henriksen gripped Kathleen's hand. His calloused fingers, the hands of a master carpenter, trembled. I have spent my life fighting the wood, Kathleen. I'd like to spend the rest of it learning the earth. If you'll have me, I'd like to help you expand this place come spring. Not for charity, but for the honor of it. The legacy of Daniel. In April, when the first Pasqua flowers began to poke through the softening soil, Kathleen's son was born. He was born in the warmth of the dugout, with Mrs. Vanderberg and Mrs. Henriksen acting as his midwives. They didn't see a disgraced child. They saw the boy who had been kept warm by the very hill that saved them all. She named him Daniel. God is my judge. And the town of Broken Creek accepted him as their own. As the years passed, the landscape of Nebraska began to change. The Broken Creek style became famous across the territory. It was a way of building that used the earth's mass, the south-facing sun, and the thermal stones that Kathleen had pioneered. The wooden tombs were replaced by sod mansions and integrated hill houses that remained cool in the 100-degree summers and warm in the 40-below winters. Kathleen O'Brien lived to see her hair turn as white as the blizzard of '80. She saw her son grow to be the most respected man in the county. She saw her grandchildren playing on the green, grassy roof of her home. When she finally passed away, at the age of 74, she didn't want a grand marble monument in the town cemetery. She wanted to be buried on her hill, in the earth that had been her only mother. Her headstone was a simple river stone, taken from the thermal battery beneath her stove. It bore no long epitaph, only her name and a single line that the people of Broken Creek remembered for generations. She did not fight the wind. She listened to the earth. The story of Kathleen O'Brien remains a whisper in the tall grass of Nebraska. It is a reminder to a modern world of glass and steel that sometimes the greatest strength is found in the deepest humility. That when the storms of life come screaming out of the north, the answer isn't to build higher walls, to shut the world out. It is to find the wisdom to let the earth hold you.